We now want to get the data that is stored on this server. And for that, I want to connect this load submitted experiences button. So in the user experiences component, we previously received results as a prop. That will no longer be the case, so we can remove that. Instead now, I want to manage some data in here and have my results as a data key. And initially it's an empty array. Now I also want to add some methods here though, or one method to be precise, a method that should be triggered when this button is clicked. So here I want to add a click listener to the space button and trigger the load experiences method. Now that's a method we need to add now, so make sure you add it under that same name to methods. And in here, we now want to send another HTTP request to the server we previously sent our data to, but now to get data. For that, we can of course copy this request from learning-survey.view and bring it over to this new load experiences method. Now here, I want to send a request to this same address which I used for storing the data, but now it should be a get request instead of a post request, because we want to get data. The good thing is that would be the default, so we don't even need to set this. Now since we're getting data, we'll also not have any body, so we can remove that as well, because a GET request does not carry any data. And now here for the headers, since there is no body, we also don't need the headers. So we have an empty config object, and therefore we are also allowed to delete it. This will now send a request to get the data. But we'll face a problem with that. When we send this request, how do we get access to the data that will eventually be loaded? Well, fetch returns a so-called promise. Now, what's a promise and why do we need that? Well, as I just said, the data will be loaded eventually. As you can imagine, if you're sending an HTTP request, that can take a couple of milliseconds or seconds. Firebase is super fast and my local internet is pretty fast, so it should be pretty quick. But still, it might take 100, 200, 500 milliseconds for the data to arrive. And JavaScript is a language that will not pause and wait with the other code execution until that result is there. That is good because it would mean, if it would pause, that our web apps would freeze all the time waiting for some behind-the-scenes HTTP request to finish. So that's the idea behind promises. Fetch returns an object on which we can listen for the data once it is there, to then set up code that will be executed when that data is there. And we set up such a listener by adding a then method here on the result of fetch. The then method takes a function which will be executed once the result is there. It will be executed automatically by the browser once the data is there. And in here, we'll also get an argument automatically, and that will be the response of this request. So the response sent back by the server to the browser. Now here we can then work with that response and try to parse it. We can, for example, check if the response is OK. This response object, which we get automatically by the browser, has an OK property that indicates whether it was a successful request or not. So for example, if the server sends back a 404 code, this would not be OK. If it is OK, however, we can continue with the response and try to read the data that's in there. For that, the response has various methods. For example, it has a JSON method which we can call, which will parse the data that's part of the response if it's in JSON format. And JSON is the de facto standard for exchanging data, and therefore, not only do we send data in JSON format when we send the request, Firebase also replies with JSON data when we get data from it. So the JSON method is the method we want to use for parsing the data that's part of the response. Now this also turns out to yield a promise, and therefore what we can do here inside of such a then block here is we can return this response JSON call here, so we can return the promise yielded by that. And we can add another then method after the first then method. And this then method will be triggered when this return promise is done. So here we have another function, but here we'll get the actual data which response JSON yielded. And that's now the place where we have access to the data, and therefore here for the moment I will just log it. We'll take care about error handling later. For the moment, let's just see if we can get that data. So let's save everything, open up the developer tools, reload, and click Load Submitted Experiences. And after half a second or a second, you should see some data here. And that indeed is the data that was stored on the server. It has this Firebase ID, and then stored under that ID, we have a nested object with a name and a rating. So fetching that data works. Now, of course, we don't just want to fetch it and log it to the console, but we want to output it on the screen. Now, to do that, all we got to do here is we have to add it to the results we have here, or set results to a new array which is full of that data. Now, setting this results equal to data will not do the trick, because data is not an array. It's a JavaScript object with this ID as a property name, and then in there we have another nested object with name and rating. I actually want to work with an array instead, and therefore we need to transform the data. I'll add a results array here, an empty one, and then I will go through all the IDs in data. Keep in mind that data is an object full of such ID properties. So now I'm going through all those IDs here. And I will push a new object to my results array here, to this temporary results array for every ID property I find in data. And there I'll set an ID key to this ID, which I'm getting here, so to the property names used in data, and set a name equal to data for that ID, so this data object, and there accessing this dynamic ID property. And then there we have a name and a rating field, so here dot name, and set rating equal to data ID rating. That is how I'm generating a bunch of objects with an ID, name, and rating field based on the data we're fetching from Firebase, and I'm adding that all to my temporary results array. And once we're done with this for loop here, I will set this results, so the results data property we're managing here, I'll set this results equal to my temporary results. And that should be all the code we need to transform the incoming data and load it onto our screen. So if we now reload and load the submitted experiences, I get an error. Cannot set property results of undefined. I'm getting this because the this keyword in here actually turns out to not refer to my view instance object, unfortunately. The easiest way of working around that is that we don't use this function syntax here, but this arrow function syntax instead. Arrow functions are another way of writing functions in JavaScript. They work like regular functions, but they have one key difference, that this keyword inside of them does refer to the same context as it does outside of them. And therefore now this will refer to the view instance object. So with that, if I set this and reload and load the submitted experiences, eventually we see the experience here. And if I now would add more data, more experiences, and I load those, we see all those experiences show up here. And that, of course, is a great step forward. Now we're able to save data on a server, and we can also fetch it from there. Now there are a couple of improvements and additions we can make.